Hi, everyone. I'm Charlie Hogward, as you can see by my name there. And I would like to introduce this panel on scholarship and industry, the informative power of research. And I'm going to go to Jen first. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi all. Thanks for coming to our panel and to this event. My name is Jen. I'm a prof at the University of Waterloo, which is a couple hours from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I'm a sociologist, so I mostly work with and study people, but I also teach courses in ethics and values in design at our Interaction Design and Business program. A little bit about my work. I've been studying game development, mostly with small-scale game developers and incubators and game making communities for a really long time. So some of the projects that I've worked on are looking at, right now we're launching a new project with where we track grads of game dev programs over their first 3 years, looking at the differences in employment experiences and outcomes for marginalized groups, especially women and people of color. So that should be really interesting. With my grad student, Matthew Perks, we did a study of gender-focused funding initiatives in Canada's game scene, and we interviewed studio heads about how their practices changed when arts funding started to prioritize or award more points for studios that had at least 40% women in leadership positions. And we looked at, well, did this increase the sort of percentage of women in these roles, and what were some of the outcomes, and what were some of the problems associated with counting and tokenizing gender in this way, and you know, the argument that studios should start embracing diversity because it will make them more money. Some of my other work is mostly with collaborators Bart Simon and Phelan Parker. We're the indie interface sort of projects, which you can find online. And we look at the invisible work, the care work, the cat herding work, the shit work that's commonly gendered and unappreciated and unpaid in the games industry, mostly done by women in studios, but also organizations like co-working spaces, community orgs like Women in Games or Indie Megabooth. And so our Indie Megabooth papers and missing producer papers on this are really good examples of this, and the double and the triple shifts of smaller developers and organizations take on as they hustle and sort of wear multiple hats, from designers to community managers to biz dev to HR, and try and bootstrap their way up. And currently I'm working with grad students on community building and moderation and how these regulations and guidelines are created on platforms, but also what it means to be curating and collecting audiences and communities and streaming, for example, and when that becomes as important to your survival as a studio or a game maker as the games that you actually make. And all in all, I'm really interested in labor and how can we get paid doing what we love, and how can we make sure that it's not the same people always getting paid and making the decisions, and that there's room for more diverse people and diverse experiences in the industry. Yeah, I'll pass it on.
Excellent. So Ilva, what about yourself?
Hi, yes. My name is Ilva Grifstadt. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at a university in Finland called Aalto University. I am also a university lecturer in Sweden at a university called Malmö University. So I'm in this interesting, peculiar situation where postdoc can be everywhere and everything in order to work and be involved in all kinds of projects and network and so on. So I'm a historian. I have a PhD from the University of Helsinki, which was on a project about counterfactual history and game design practices. So the focus of that project was basically to look at how the studios that are making digital strategy games are organized and how the different contexts that they exist in, the economical, the political, the social, and so on, influences the way they work, and in turn, the historical representation in the games that they are making. So very much interested in the sort of epistemological framings and how they interact in terms of, you know, what kind of history is being made in these places, and how is it made, and how this influences things like, for example, gender representation and so on. And so yeah, the current projects that I'm involved in is something about small games in big contexts. So we're working on a project about playable concepts, which is essentially putting very tiny games in, for example, scholarly texts to enhance the reading experience, but also using the gaming format, if you will, to enhance and add value to these contexts. I also have a tiny background in game development. I spent about 7 months making games in Malmö before I started my PhD. And I also have a lot of experience working with esports on a sort of voluntary basis with big projects on grassroots esports and how to facilitate more equality and more gender representation in esports in general, mainly in Sweden and different both local and national level. Yeah. So I guess my aim with my research is usually to bring added value also to the humanities by looking at games and seeing how games can sort of help inform the way we look at the different topics that we study in the humanities. But I also want to make sure that there's sort of a tangible reciprocity there, that we can also be collaborative with the games industry and the game makers that we study. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Jess. Oh, sorry, Charlie.
Super interesting. Thank you. And Jess, what about yourself?
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. It's a pleasure to be here with Jen, Ilva, and Charlie. So I'm Jess. I am currently a professional in the games industry. I'm a user experience researcher at Electronic Arts, where I support a variety of projects, specifically game development projects over the course of development. So my role is to work with the stakeholders to understand what the design intent is for the project and what they want to learn through playtesting, through putting the game in front of players and getting feedback from them. And that feedback, I take that feedback and generate insights so the developers can continue to improve the design and the user experience over the course of development. And that allows us to make better games. User experience research is done all over the games industry. Prior to working at EA, I was with Bethesda on their user experience team as well. So I am a researcher working in industry, but I also have an academic background. So like my co-panelists, I have a PhD. I have a PhD from Indiana University in media arts and sciences, which is a very broad program of study. But in that program, I was focusing on the social psychology of games and representation in games and what this means for players. So most of my academic research did focus on examining games, players, content creators, and representation in games through the lens of gender and representation. One of my latest publications was about the design of game characters and how the identity of the game developers impacts the stereotype depictions we've historically seen in games. And I was often to leverage some of Jen's fabulous research in a very similar area of study where Jen has looked at production practices on game teams. So I am here as both an industry practitioner who does research and someone who has published academically on games and gender and production. So happy to be here and excited for today's discussion.
Yeah, and I am almost finished with my PhD, and I'm a researcher as well. I work for Abertay University. My PhD is in the use of role-playing games to enhance the second language acquisition of Mandarin and English. But my latest research that I'm doing now that I'm finding a little bit more interesting than my PhD topic, but I think that's what happens, is about the use of digital games as a conduit to preserve indigenous languages, cultures, and traditions. And so I've been working with Maori, Iwi tribes, Lakota Sioux game developer, First Nations in Canada, and Anishinaabe. And so how we can take something very, very old, which is where Ilva, I find your historical aspect super interesting, and marry it with something very, very modern, which is where, Jen, I find your research very interesting because it's also about that surveillance and that use of people's data and people's the work and the indigenous heritages and things that shouldn't necessarily be shared or could be shared. And then just for yourself, the idea of the way that females and people are represented within games and games made about them as well. So I am really happy to be chairing this panel because, yeah, I'm going to learn so much from you guys and possibly end up quoting all of you. But let's go to the first question. So, and this is kind of a big question. Why is research important to the games industry? Is it just like an academic or tick box exercise, or is there actual practical implications? And Jess, you've unmuted first.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I work in industry, so I'm happy to take a first take on this. So research during development is a vital. It is increasingly becoming something that AAA industries and even indie developers are taking on as part of the production cycle. Now, I will caveat it that a lot of the research that is undertaken in industry is from a user experience point of view. So it's all with the end goal of improving game design and essentially with the objective of selling more games, right? So it's not research for the sake of research. It's not research for the sake of theory building or necessarily. It's with the goal of making the product better, which ultimately is good for business. Now, in line with user research, which is focused on user experience and improving design, there's also a lot of companies also have market research teams or consumer insights teams that are complementary, but of course, looking at big market trends or looking at competitors, the competition, and what is attracting players to the competition. So again, in service of business, improving and elevating the quality of the brand, the product, and ultimately with the goal of making money, because of course games is a business. Now, on the other hand, I will say that some of the more research lately that's been happening in the industry, I think is very aware that there are things that we need to work on that are for the greater good. So lately there's been a lot of involvement in accessibility research and understanding like that just makes gaming better for everyone and is good for the industry when we share accessibility learnings and best practices across the industry. In line with that, there's been a movement coming out of the AAA industry called the Fair Play Alliance, which is about sharing best practices for addressing toxicity and cultivating positive play in virtual worlds. So there is, of course, an aspect that will always be focused on the product and focusing on what is good for business. But I think lately, because there's games are becoming an increasingly more popular medium. They're becoming something that isn't necessarily, it's mainstream, right? Like gaming is just pervasive. It's ubiquitous. It's a thing that basically everyone's doing in some way or another. And so I think the industry is starting to realize, okay, this is good for our company and our values and for just making the industry better overall. And that's where I think the accessibility research and toxicity and even some of the research that goes on for improving representation in games as well. There's a lot of outreach to consultants and getting expert consultant opinions on certain representational aspects of games, which is becoming very important during development as well.
Yeah, I think that to build off of Jess's points is that academic research is great when the questions you want answered have nothing to do with how do we get players to play longer or make us more money. And academic research is actually really great, even if you're looking at games user research or UX or things like that, for ensuring that that research reaches as many people as possible, not just people who, have the benefit of working in a large studio that have UX experts, right? Or can go to GDC. So if you're interested in UX and games user research, you can go to Kai Play website and download all of those academic papers to find more information on how to hone your craft, even if you're a smaller dev studio. I think that the value of academic research changes according to what type of research it is, right? Like if you're interested in decreasing the number of mid-career women leaving games, that's an academic question, right? If you're interested in how to design interfaces and affordances for your platform in ways that reduce the chances of people being assholes, that's an academic question. If you're interested in building better art tools or ways to like collaborate in diverse teams, or studying the impact of games on mental health, or how you learn or retain knowledges like Charlie's doing, that's an academic question. I think yesterday in the sessions, there was this really great example about one of the speakers just wanted to turn up the freaking air conditioning and turn it down in their office because the studio was too cold. Instead of just asking, which she wouldn't have been taken seriously for, she had to go for research to show that women were more productive when the temperature was suitable to what they were wearing, right? So that's like an academic question. And I think that if you look at things like the IGDA quality of life game developer satisfaction surveys, which are done by colleagues of mine, this is really, really important to sort of measure where we are across the industry in terms of like who gets paid most, who gets promoted, who's working longer hours or not, measuring them and giving these numbers that can't be hidden and that are beyond just one studio, so that we can mark where the problem areas are and measure when we're improving. And I think that academic research is a little bit more transparent in that way. And they won't hide some of the answers that are a little bit uglier or that might impact, you know, shareholder satisfaction in the ways that larger game studios will. Yeah.
Fantastic answer. Ilva, what about yourself?
Well, there are not too many things I could add to this because you're all making excellent points already, obviously. But I suppose it's worth reiterating that this sort of the research side of things, the sort of strictly academic side of things, does quite a lot of heavy lifting on a sort of grander scale in terms of pointing out the stuff that is not immediately obvious to us. You know, the subtleties of human interaction and the subtleties of power relations and this sort of thing. And that's, I mean, like Jen mentioned, it's a long game. You have to be able to, you do these studies over time to be able to compare them and see how things change. But it is also a way to sort of slowly and sort of with a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Tenacity, sort of keep bringing this up so that there's not any sort of laxness going on in terms of, you know, remembering that these are important questions that affect people in the daily lives, and having the expertise to be able to point out how it affects them and how we may be able to find them and see them more clearly. And I think having this sort of educational value, I guess, I mean, at a sort of very ground level, but still is also worth pointing out in this area or in this question. And I also want to just mention that I think this sort of academic exercise is not necessarily a just. I think it's actually something that is very important to sort of maintain this investigation through thought and maintaining these sort of slightly higher level questions to make sure that we sort of, yeah, stay on top of that also in terms of games, but coming from me, obviously from a very sort of humanities inspired perspective, studying games sort of from almost from the outside, but also seeing how over time the discourses change and that the vocabulary and the things that we tend to take for granted inside academia actually becomes part of the discourse in game studios, for example. And when that happens, there's obviously some back and forth going on, which is usually a very good thing. Yeah.
Definitely. And so from my own research point of view, I kind of run to an ethos that was told to me by an Anishinaabe elder, Morris Switzer, which is nothing about us without us. So I'm Scottish. Don't make a game about the Highland clearances in Scotland without having any Scottish people at all involved in that game. And this can be transferred to any culture, any Indigenous group of people. So we're actually working to create an advisory board for the games industry, purely on the idea of not being a tick box. Yeah, oh well, we've checked with the Indigenous people, the game's fine, but to actually help provide the research, and that's what it's about. The research can be so powerful and so informative, but also be able to put Indigenous peoples themselves in that position where they can contribute to the industry. So research, I think, is a very, very powerful thing if used correctly and not, you know, taken out of context. But as we're all women, we all research, we all play games. What kind of obstacles do you think are in our way? We're going to go with Ilva first, I think.
So, excuse me, in thinking about this a little bit beforehand, the first thing that came to mind is the sort of from the perspective of using a lot of ethnography, for example, in my research. I find that the communication sometimes can be tricky with informants in certain instances. For example, I've personally at least run into some of this, what's your understanding of games? Because from where I'm sitting, those who can't do teach. So since I'm an academic, there's a lot of things that I might not know about game design or games in general. So it's not necessarily a gender issue, but I suspect that there might be some of that in there too. So in practice and in doing research, you can run into obstacles like that. But I'm interested in hearing examples and experiences from the rest of you as well.
I think there are way more opportunities than obstacles for sort of a research at this point, especially if you're a woman or somebody who's marginalized. Everybody's starting to think, oh, maybe we should get on board this diversity thing and have a panel that isn't all white dudes, right? Just like in the game industry, academia has the same issues with ableism, racism, sexism, classism. But I think the key obstacles are that we need to sort of be really aware of the ways that our passion for our work and our research can sometimes be exploited. And that you'll end up going and doing all this research or making a game or something like that in promise of future returns or exposure or things like that. And so that our passion will lead us to working for free rather than actually valuing our work and paying for our damn work and not overworking. So I think that that's a key sort of obstacle for both women in research and in the game industry.
What's your take on this, Jess?
Yeah, it's a great question. Both Jen and Ilva brought up excellent points. I think anytime, I guess you're as an academic going about research, I think there's maybe always the risk that if you are wanting to make your work speak to the industry and make an impact, there's maybe always that risk that you might not have the impact that you want, if that makes sense. I know that was something that I struggled with when I was still a PhD student and still focused primarily on academia. Like a lot of PhD students, I thought I would end up being a professor and teaching and continuing to do research, but I discovered after about 3 or 4 years that a lot of my research questions that I was asking were more practical in nature and were more suited to the industry. So I think if you are an academic researcher, you might be in a situation where you're like me and you just find that the types of questions you're asking are just more suitable for industry. And maybe you do consider an industry path because maybe that's more fulfilling for you. But I know that I've been, at least in my game scholarly communities, I have encountered other academics who are frustrated by the fact that there aren't a lot of opportunities to collaborate with industry when you are an academic. And I think Jen's an excellent example of someone who's been able to cross that divide, but it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of persistence. It takes a lot of networking and gaining trust to make that happen. And I know that is just something that I've encountered in my scholarly circles. And that this is more in the social sciences approach to game studies, where I was networking back in the day. But I know like something that came up constantly was like, why doesn't the industry share more of their data? Why aren't they collaborating with us more? And, I think to answer that question, it's just industry needs to see the value of your research. And ultimately, like I said earlier, it's about adding something to business value, which I know is not the goal of every academic research project. A lot of it is about, we want to push forward knowledge, we want to build up a theory, we want to grow a theory, we want to generate new theories to explain a phenomenon. And that is just unfortunately not sufficient most of the time to get a meaningful industry collaboration. So I guess I hope that doesn't come across too pessimistic. If anything, I would say if you find that you're like myself, maybe industry research is better for you, or if you are an academic who wants to work have your research bridge that gap, just know that it does take a lot of networking, but there are also people like Jen, people like myself in the industry who value academics. So I don't want to say like it's too much of a risk or an obstacle.
Definitely. I don't think you were too pessimistic at all. I think, honesty is always valued. From my own perspective, I don't think being female has had any impact at all on my research. But then I have a male name. So Charlie could easily be a boy's name. But it's not anything that I've ever found as an obstacle. The only obstacle is when you accept all of these different opportunities to do research and then realize 3 months down the line, they all have the same deadline. That's a major, major obstacle. But yeah, I mean, really interesting inputs there. But if we're looking to the future of research, and this could be from your own perspective, your own research, or research for games in general, which areas do you think maybe you would like to follow, or that the industry or academia needs to expand more on? And we're going to go to Jess first, I think.
Wow. Yeah, that's such an exciting question because there's so much possibility space with the intersection of games and research. I think all of us are a really wonderful example of that. I think for me personally, diversity and inclusion has always been near and dear to my heart. It's what a lot of my academic research speaks to that. It's something I push for in my professional life as well. So, Jen, I'm so excited to hear what you find with that research project of following graduates of game design programs over the course of their early careers and late careers, and whether they churn out of the industry, because I think that is going to shed so many wonderful insights about what educators and industry can be doing better to retain diverse candidates, because that is such an important question. So I would honestly say something like that, speaking to quality of life. I think there is that ongoing quality of life study for game developers, which is super important. But I think more work like Jen is doing in terms of what are educational programs doing to set students up for success, and what are companies doing for early career professionals to support them and retain them, because churn is such, I study churn in players, but there's also a phenomenon of churn of professionals in this industry, particularly underrepresented folks, women, people of color, queer people, etc. A lot of folks just don't feel safe, or they feel burnt out, and we are often carrying a lot of extra emotional unpaid labor, and that takes a toll on people. And I think understanding that, more rigorously, I think is something game companies really need to be paying attention to, for sure. We're losing a lot of good talent.
Jen, what about yourself?
Yeah, that changes every day, right? The beautiful thing about being an academic is I find a new question and I can go chase that like butterflies. I think that I teach a lot on dark patterns and ethics and values in design and compulsive design and things like that. And so I think that people aren't paying enough attention to compulsive design and how developers might need to now think more about developing moral and ethical responsibility and designing for platforms and systems that are explicitly geared to exploit psych hacks to get you playing longer, to spend more money in game, to invite your friends and to give up more of your data, especially because this is these sort of mechanics from games are moving further and further outside into, our education spaces, our workplaces to make us more productive, our social media platforms to get us to share more. So I think that that's sort of the ethics and morals that each individual designer has in terms of gameful design, and where your line is in terms of exploitation, I think, and how technology like this can be persuasive. I think that is really, really interesting area for research for me that I would love more on. And like, I just wanted to, actually, I'll hop back, but I wanted to note that I saw a question in the Q&A about how do you start an academic journey, or where do you start with that? We have answers for that, so we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah. And that's actually the next question, so don't worry. But Ilva, on this topic, what's your input?
Right, yeah, all good, very good answers already. Especially Jen, I guess, towards the end here, talking about tools, for example, that's something that needs to be sort of deconstructed and studied at a slightly more nuanced level. I think it's something that people have started doing. Jen has already done good work on this, and how tools sort of constitute design practices and that sort of thing. Very important also from a sort of game tech perspective. And also that sort of comes into the next thing that I want to talk about, which is sort of games beyond industry, and how, we spent a lot of time talking about sort of the different principles of the games industry and how the context and so on. But I think also this is also being done, but it's a very big area, and I think there's a lot of work to be done to finding out about new hobbyist practices, for example, and game making, outside of the industry, also potentially then in conjunction with tools, and how this tools market is now, it's sort of perceived as something that is inherently on offer for you to be creative and do good things, but that is also contains a lot of potentially problematic things like collection of data and so on, as already mentioned. And I suppose I would be remiss if I didn't also mention game history, because I think it's something that has been done, but can also be done in bigger volumes. And I would also really like to see game history integrated to a larger extent into the game training programs at universities, for example, because a lot of game design programs today do not necessarily provide students with historical perspectives, a game history course as part of the curriculum, if you will, to be able to go forward. As a historian, I'm more or less obligated to say that we need to also know something about where we come from. And the game development, especially the digital game development history, is now coming to a point where it's actually quite long, and we run the risk of sort of not having the entire history inherent with us unless we actually start teaching it as well to game designers. So those would be my main points.
Amazing answers from everyone, and we're going to go on to the last question, which comes from the chat, and that is, what advice would you have for someone who is just thinking about starting out as a researcher, or is trying to transition from academia to research? My own opinion would be, find something you love and you're really, really interested in, and then follow that and research it. A lot of my research started as me doing a hobby in the evenings. It's just something that I got really interested in, and I'm lucky enough with my job, I was able to take that into my work and have that be part of my work. I've also done research on projects that I'm not so interested in, and it's really hard. So that's my advice. Jen, what about you? It's a tricky question.
It's a great question. So I have a lot of really pragmatic answers for it. So the first sort of thing is to start figuring out where exactly you want to go in academia, because it's so broad, right? Mm-hmm. And that way, I would suggest sort of following some women in games who are in academia to see if you like what they're throwing down. Kishona Gray is amazing. Afra Kerr is wonderful. Mia Consalvo, Johanna Westar. So these are women academics who have, tweet a lot and write brilliant things on games. So that's sort of a nice way to get into the women's in games academic sort of networks. Bo Ruberg, who is this really wonderful queer games scholar, has this really great blog post about getting into academic sort of games and where you start. So getting into game studies. So I would sort of go to her site first. I'd also sort of dip my toes in, just like if you're interested in getting in games or getting a foot in the industry, you may go to GDC or something like that. For academia, you might try to check out some of the conferences or read some of the conference papers. Academic work conferences would be DIGRA, which is the Digital Games Research Association, DIGRA, and their papers are all online that you could mostly read them. Different Games is really great. Consoling Passions is really great for, you know, more diverse perspectives on games and game studies. The Canadian Game Studies Association, even though it's sort of Canada, it has a lot of, it's very feminist and it's very fun. And academics, we're geeks and we love to help out and answer questions and invite people into our world. And so that's definitely just follow somebody on Twitter and ping them with questions. Like, we're friendly. We want to help. We don't bite.
So brilliant. Ilva, what about yourself?
Yeah, it's a really tricky question because I think you'll find that everyone had a slightly different path into games research. I suppose I could repeat what you said about finding questions that really resonate with you is hugely important, not least because otherwise it gets really tough and dredgy, I guess, can be at least. I guess my other tip, again, at the risk of coming off as a very sort of old-fashioned academic here, but doing a lot of reading or engaging with materials that sort of are related to the questions that you're interested, whether it's sort of it doesn't necessarily have to be scientific papers at all. It can be, you know, in blogs that interest you, or following certain people on YouTube, for example, that tend to raise questions that you're interested in. It's a really good way of sort of starting to sort of chew through some of that stuff and see where your interests really lie, and having a sort of a good foundation to stand on when you start asking those really critical questions, I think is really useful, and also makes it a lot more fun and more interesting to work with in this area. So that would be my answer. And also, of course, yeah, the resources that Jen mentioned, I can only second those.
Thank you. And finally, Jess.
Yeah, just to piggyback off the already excellent statements, I think part of it is kind of finding your people in academia, because the thing with games is that you can be in a media school and study games. You can be in a sociology department and study games. You can be in history and study games. You can be in English and study games, et cetera, and so on, right? So there's, I guess, no really wrong way to go about studying games as a medium. So many considerations to consider. Gravitate towards the questions that interest you, and find your people who are studying similar things, asking similar questions. Like Jen said, a good way to find those people happens to be on Twitter. There's a number of even Facebook groups around certain communities like DIGRA. And when I was in academia, my conference was International Communication Association and the National Communication Association. But that's just because the media school I was in leaned to those certain conferences. You'll find that once you're in academia, whatever program or school or department you're in will just often have conferences that people have, like faculty and students have historically gone to. But look for like the special interest groups in those conferences to find your people. That's what I did for the Communication Association conferences. There was a game studies special interest group, and that was how I found people and, you know, scholars who were asking the same sort of questions I was, and helped motivate me and encourage me and inspire me. Now, when it comes to being a researcher in industry, it's different, right? I would encourage folks to reach out to people you might know through Twitter or LinkedIn to learn more. And I think are we at time, by the way?
We are at time, but I think, you know, one minute over is going to be fine.
I'm just going to add one more thing. So if you are interested in being a games user experience researcher, we have a wonderful community called Games Research and User Experience Special Interest Group. The acronym is GRUX. So if you go to grux.org, you'll find everything there is to know about games user research and how to be a professional in this industry. Lots of resources, mentoring program. We even have an online Discord that is incredibly active, and there's a lot of students who ask brilliant questions all the time. Think of the Discord as an archive of questions that people have been asking for years and years and years, because you can search through a Discord pretty easily. So those would be my recommendations for anyone wanting to be an industry researcher, is check out Grux.
Excellent, fantastic advice. And just to add, you don't need to be in a university to be able to do research. If you want to find out more about something and you want to write about something, just do it. Don't feel that you have to be going for a PhD or a master's or whatever. You know, your viewpoint and your interpretation of the matter or your solutions are equally valid. So do it, I would say. But thank you so much. We're out of time. I could keep babbling on for hours, but thank you all so much for your time. And I really, really appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you, Charlie. Thanks,
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. And the questions, we can send them to you so you can look over them later. So no questions are wasted. Okay.
I didn't think there was only that one question in the question room.
There was another
good.
question in the chat, but that's fine. Really
Perfect.
Good question. So, okay, we can leave. Thank you very much. Enjoy what is beginning to be your day as my day ends.